And now moving into our next conversation, it is going to be a conversation on design through the lens of healing and vital modalities for restoration and transformation. So, including writer, entrepreneur, and philanthropic innovator, Rachel Cargle, a multidisciplinary artist, curator, educator, Andrea Yarbrough, a multidisciplinary artist, author, and podcast host of Deem's Dreaming Different podcast. You should check it out wherever you find your podcast, Jezz Chung. And it will be moderated by curator and art administrator, Marguerite Wynter. So let's have a round of applause for our next conversation.
Wow, good morning, everyone. Yeah, how's everyone feeling so far? Rested? Wonderful, so nice to see all of you. Very busy, packed house. Thank you so much to the MCA and to Deem Journal team that has gone above and beyond to have us here today. And this is just the start of this really enriching weekend, and we're so happy to be here and hold space with all of you and have this conversation. And I am so honored to be on stage with these three thinkers, practitioners, storytellers, multi-hyphenates that we have here today that are more than your titles and what you do. So we met on Zoom a month ago to talk about how we would shape this conversation and what does it look like to talk about care and healing across all of these disciplines. And so we know that care is not a linear kind of notion. It takes many manifestations. So to start us off and to open our conversation, I want to talk about how and hear you talk about how care and healing is very much of a buzzword right now, right? Everyone's talking about self-care, whether it's you're putting on a face mask or you're taking your moment to meditate, rest, breathe, go for a walk. But it doesn't always look the same for all of us. It's not, as I mentioned before, linear across mainstream or for everybody in their communities. So I'm wondering if each of you can share a little bit about how this idea of care and this notion really manifests in your own practice and how you engage with it in the communities that you work with and for. Whoever wants to start.
I'll go. Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be here and to be in this particular company to have this conversation. What comes to mind for me is two things, both my personal practice, like my inner practice, as well as the work that I do in more organized ways, like through my foundation and just other public work. And one of the biggest things about how care has looked within myself is just this idea of self-knowing, of knowing myself well enough to feel confident to move through the world without feeling like any and everything will completely dissolve me. And one of the methods of capitalism, one of the methods of white supremacy is this intention that they know us better than we know us. They know what we need. They can be the missionaries of, all of our care. And so this practice of self-knowing, of recognizing that I know me better than anyone else knows me, and I can speak to my care both within myself, as Tricia mentioned, this reality that our body is the space of liberation and there's no saving that has to happen. And that has been really important for me to be in ongoing conversation with myself, this study of self, to remember that I am well and I can continue to be well as I move through the world.
I love that study of self. I think that's something I do a lot. I'm very deeply curious. I resonate with everything Tricia was talking about in terms of dreaming as this act of kind of creating this new reality. For me, I've experienced chronic depression and anxiety since I was The first SI or suicidal ideation thoughts I remember having was when I was like 7 years old. So it's something I've just lived with my whole life, and in order to survive, I've had to dream. So dreaming has been my biggest medicine, my biggest antidote, my biggest survival mechanism, and it's and a lot of different movements and practices inform my work. I'm deeply, deeply invested in disability justice, in abolition, and figuring out how I can transform myself to transform the world. That's something I learned from Grace Lee Boggs. She was an organizer, philosopher, incredible thinker based in Detroit. And so that's kind of in anything I do, and I'm very multidisciplinary in writing, performing. I've done theater. Now I'm making music very randomly, starting a month ago. So I'm just constantly tuning into, feeling into the reality of what is possible in the future, and how can I divest from these systems of harm that we live within, and how can I invest in a culture of care. And so everything I do, that's just kind of my guiding principle and my compass of sorts when I'm like, okay, should I say yes to this? Who should I build community with? Everything I'm thinking about, how can I divest from harm and invest in care?
So yeah, for me, as someone who runs an initiative called In Care of Black Women, I feel like I've been in the trendy space of care, and I've felt it a lot in terms of collaborations and people who want to come to say, oh, we care deeply about Black women. And what I've learned is that we don't, and that we don't like to acknowledge that. And the invitation is here for us to really rethink our relationship to care, ourselves, and Black women, and what that looks like and how it shows up. So for me, what I'm thinking a lot about is, how do I care from other people from a space that's not about me? Because so many times we're showing up to say that, like, oh, I'm caring for you, but it's because it makes me feel good to care for you in this way, and it's not the way that the person actually wants to be cared for. And so really rethinking what my relationship to care is, asking people. We do a project called Tending To, in which we interview Black women about their relationship to care. And so there's no reason, you can't say that I didn't know. There's an entire interview in which you can sit and listen to someone speak to their needs, and you can move from that space versus moving from your own space of like, this is how I think you need to be cared for.
I like what you say about not putting your type of care and what is good for you onto others and not making your reflection. And I just wonder how you work with that boundary or that tension of being able to care for someone else, but then not making it always about you, or how do you deal with that? And especially when we're talking about working with and for marginalized communities and knowing what's best for you, but then really having to tune to them, like outside of these conversations. What does that look like?
I can share. So for me, it looks like having a care team, and a very explicit care team, and that I have a group of friends who I can go to and I know how they can show up and when they will show up for specific things, which takes a lot of courage and vulnerability to say, hey, I'm going through this very particular thing in my life, and I need some assistance and some support. But it's recognizing that when they do show up, they're showing up with a limited amount of capacity, and I also have to recognize that and not ask them to overstretch themselves to show up for me in a way that feels meaningful.
This is making me, think back to a bit of what Tricia said as well, that this work that has been done over generations, that we have blueprints, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel or even try to quote unquote figure out what's necessary, that we have so much material in womanism, in Black feminism, in many industries in which particularly Black or Indigenous women have touched and have written and have lectured and have built out frameworks for us to look to. And so I'm actually really invested in more intergenerational conversations in which we could be sharing these tools and this knowledge as a form of community care. And I also have to touch on, because it's really been on my heart in big ways, the necessity to continue to honor the activist even when they age out of the types of symposiums we're having or the media that might want someone to speak on an issue, knowing that there's these activists who have done work for so many years and who have exhausted themselves and who also aren't being cared for because they're not getting the checks for being on the panels, because they're not the hottest thing that people are interested in hearing from, that we need to be bringing them back into the conversations, not only as an act of care, but the reality that they have information and tools that we can continue to be building on and utilizing. And so I think intergenerational conversations are a huge part of a way for us to care for our elders, but also for us to care for ourselves.
I love everything of what y'all said, especially as frameworks. There is such a deep lineage of thinkers who have tried this over again. We were just talking about this. They've done it and strategized and iterated, and now we get to iterate beyond that and bring that into the future. And I'm thinking about, I was in LA the other week. I went to Cal State's encampment. They had only been up for 24 hours. And in 24 hours, they had set up this like fully functioning economy with a medic tent, free food, full day of programming, including somatic healing sessions, teach-in study sessions, free libraries, music, art, an herbal healing kit making station where they grew herbs from their own garden. They were just, I felt like I entered this portal into the future. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I think the state tells us it can't exist like that. Like the state tells us we have to depend on them for these kinds of care. I'm thinking about what this scholar named Alan Lopez said, that friendship is the strongest form of abolition because it creates a sense of belonging that doesn't rely on the state. Right, and so when I think about that, I think of how can we create those care circles. I think about a framework I want to offer is from Mia Mingus, who's this incredible disability justice thinker who created pod mapping. So if you type in Mia Mingus, MIAMINGUS, pod mapping, it's a great framework to kind of figure out, well, who is my pod? Who can I count on? What do different people have different capacities for? And another framework I write about in my book, it's called This Way to Change. I write about consent, agency, and choice as this trifecta of checking in with yourself to ask that question, like, am I doing this from a place of individualism and self-gratification? Or am I doing this because solidarity, like your freedom is interconnected with mine? So I see your struggles as my struggles too. And I think we really are in this era of moving way beyond, like, fuck allyship. We don't need allyship. We need deep solidarity right now.
It's really powerful. I love what you say about friendship and that kind of idea of a pod and coming together in this community. And so I'm also wondering what sparks and motivates you the most as you reflect on personal experiences as well in relation to this like commonality that we all have in sharing community of care.
I think for me it's art right now. It's witnessing the things that are often unspeakable that can only come through something like a painting or body movement or just interpretation, new interpretations that are outside of what have been given to us. And this conversation of possibility is also us kind of stepping out of ourselves, even our own limitations, stepping out of our idea of what can I do as an individual, but remembering these people who care for us and saying, actually, they have these tools and resources, they have these ideas and perspectives that really fortify us more so than make us different, per se. And I have been really moved by the way that art allows my community to reflect themselves and for me to learn about them, to remember, oh, here's how I can care for them and here's how perhaps they can care for me. And I've really created a practice out of witnessing art and even witnessing my friends in their art to be able to fortify our relationships in ways that have really surprised me and delighted me.
Same. I've definitely been leaning into art. I'm so big on lifestyle design. Like, speaking of design, I think about every thought that you think, every conversation that you have, everything that you watch, you read, you consume as contributing to your life, designing the breadth of your life. And When I think about it like that, I just try to design the world that I want to live in, with the conversations that I have and the people that I build community with and the art that I make. And with all that's been going on, especially these past 7 months, it's been so like the amount of heartache that I feel like I've just been walking around with a broken heart for 7 months, just on the verge of tears all the time. And at the same time, I feel like this incredible expansion where all my limits are just dissolving. Mm-hmm. Like if I look at everything and I'm like putting the pieces together and like, y'all really just made this up. Mm-hmm. Like y'all really just said, oh, you're this and like this sense of hierarchy. And for me, I'm autistic, so I don't understand hierarchy inherently. It's really hard for me to agree with and participate in. So in order to kind of break that down, and even like as Tourmaline says, abolish the cop in your head, like really what are the ways I punish myself, police myself by saying, oh, I can't do that. Mm-hmm. And so when I think about even the practices that I do a lot of visualizing into the future and feeling into the full 360 sensory. What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like to feel safe, to feel free? And then what is the one thing that I can make in this moment now that contributes to that world? And it changes all the time because it's this intuitive practice. That's why it's so random that I'm writing songs lately. Like in the past month, I'm like, I'm not a songwriter, am I? But I guess I am because it's just coming out. And it's this constant like, and the policing comes in of, oh, don't do it. Like you can't be pursuing music at 33 years old because that's not what you do. And so I just constantly have to dissolve those limits within myself. And then in that creates this ripple effect of I create the art, I share it, and then people are influenced and impacted by it. So it's a cycle where we're all looking to each other for what is possible. Like, what are you doing? That's possible, so I can do it too.
It's also like allowing yourself to say yes instead of completely prohibiting yourself and saying that you have these amount of possibilities and that, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I was struggling a little bit. I'm like, don't go dark. I was gonna get a little dark. But I think that, somebody said do it. Do it. Well, I'll start by saying that, so I had a near-death experience in 2017, and it was deeply, deeply reflective and impactful in a way in which I felt like I had a rebirth. Like I came out on the other side as a very different person. And today I feel like I have a privilege in that I get to be in a solidarity economy space, in a restorative economy space, in a space that's deeply rooted in practice and in movement, and that understands the role of cultural organizing towards our liberation. These days, I'm feeling like I don't care about art. It's so frivolous sometimes. It feels like we're just like, living in our own little bubbles and worlds and not actually truly being in deep relationship with each other. It's led me to feel like I hate the word community. We're all in community here. We don't know each other, but we're all in community, Like we are not in relationship with each other. And so I'm so much more interested in the practice. Like, how do we get to the practice? How do we move beyond the theory? I don't want to work for a good boss. I don't want to work for a kind boss. I don't want to labor for other people. Mm-hmm. I want to labor towards my own liberation. And I feel like that is something that, we spend a lot of time in the theory space and not in the praxis space. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just so committed to moving us to thinking about like practice makes practice, makes practice, makes practice. We have studio practices for a reason. We don't just go in and pump out a painting. It is a practice, it's something that we learn over time. And so I feel like the practice and being in the solidarity economy space is the thing that motivates me. Being a part of an artist cooperative, being able to own and operate spaces together as artists, to be able to challenge these ideas about ownership and move towards stewardship. One thing that's been like very heavy on my mind and heart is that visual artists get no residuals. When your work resells in an auction, that person just continues to make money and you get nothing. Your fabricator who made that thing gets nothing. Your studio assistants get nothing. And how do we move beyond that? And there are ideas that allow us to try to move beyond that. And what I find is oftentimes I'm in conversation with folks who could be, really on the cuffs of pushing us into a different space. And they say things like, but what would my collector say if I just give my license to my work and not my actual work? And it's like, these are the moments where we get to choose something different and we get to practice. And that's the lineage that we come out of. Like so much of what we have today is because people chose to practice something different. And I think a lot of times our fear prevents us from being able to move towards something else. And it paralyzes us and keeps us in this space of theory, of saying we're anti-capitalist, but we don't do anything that's actually anti-capitalist. And so how do we move towards the practice is really what motivates me.
This is, yes. Thank you for saying that, and it's really making me consider the way that my foundation, the Loveland Foundation, was designed, and the intention behind not just the theory of what we were hoping to do, which is we provide free therapy to Black women and girls across the US, and what I wanted to have intentionally in that is to step away from like the philanthropic industrial complex with considerations of how they treat Black women and what they expect of us. And one of the things that I was really tired of was, in order to feel worthy of care, I had to have a really traumatic life story that I laid out on every application, on every, hope for a scholarship or a grant. I was born to a poor Black disabled mother who essentially trained me on how to answer these questions in order to get the type of support she needed, for me to get into a summer camp or for me to get into some type of program. And when we were designing even just the application process of the Loveland Foundation, all I wanted was for you to say your name and affirm that you were a Black woman. That's all I needed from you. And it also came into play where people said, well, I don't know if, I'm a doctor, but I can't afford therapy. Can I still apply for this? And the structures that tell us if you make above amount of money, some random number that some random person made up, and they don't understand that there might be a doctor who's from the Caribbean who's sending half of her money back home to her family, and that is why she's not able to get therapy. And so creating our own systems that speak to our care, not just to frameworks that have traditionally worked out. And most of our funding, we have no government funding, which means we could do what we want with our money because it's coming from individuals who trust us to be stewards of these resources. And what that has looked like is if someone, we give 12 sessions of therapy to each person who comes in, but if the therapist is like, I need to see this person a few more times and they can't afford it, we can care for ourselves the way we need to without having to fill out any paperwork and the government saying, well, we have decided these limitations and these containers for how they think we need to be cared for. And so I think that I'm really moved by your observation of moving out of just saying we want to do something, but saying I'm actually going to build something new has had such intense effects that I have seen. And to speak to what you said, Jezz, witnessing it in each other, there's so many organizations who reach out and say, your system has proven to us what is possible in this space of wild philanthropy. And so I'm really going to move with a lot of the language that you presented to continue to do that work. So thank you.
It's nice that that people don't have to justify why they need the care, right? Mm-hmm. Do we have to fill out all these forms? And the work I'm doing right now is a lot of community engagement in Boston, and everything is, well, you have to fill out why they need this, and it's well, we should just be doing this for these organizations and for the communities that we work with, right? Why do we have to justify that? So I'm wondering, my next question is, I don't want to say community anymore, Andrea.
So scared, so scared.
We had a nice community session back there before we came on stage. Jezz was saying, we're going to do great. So I'll skip that question.
All brainstorm on synonyms.
I'm kind of also sick of it too, because I feel like it's said all the time. It's like saying self-care over and over. So let's get back to design and designing for dignity and our idea of care. And why is it so important for us as practitioners, artists, to be thinking about this topic? And Andrea, you were talking about the idea of artists when they sell their work and they are not, and then it goes into auction, right? I always am telling people about it. It's so crazy thinking about you sell a painting for $50,000, then it goes to auction for $50 million and you get none of that back. And so how and what's the process like for us as practitioners and thinking of like how you care for yourself in like a situation like that, where it's like you're not being valued later on for the work that you have labored and been with and sat with for such a long time. So why is, yeah, it could go on.
I mean, I think a lot of it is deeply rooted in our systems and our policies and our practices, and like those are the things that have to be challenged. Many years ago, I was a fellow at a museum right after everything happened with George Floyd, and they created these, resolutions that they were like, these are the new practices that we're going to have, and they were like, but we're not going to make them public. And I was like, well, if you don't make them public, then where's any accountability around them? Like, who gets to come and say, hey, have you moved forward on those things? And they were like, well, we're not making them public because, institutions are slow to change. And my response was, institutions are just people. Like, institutions don't exist without us. Like, we run the spaces. And so if we're saying institutions cannot change, then we're saying people cannot change, which is not true. We can change. We get a choice on whether we want to change, and we're choosing to change or not change. And so there's this opportunity for us in the art ecosystem as collectors, as artists, as fabricators, as folks at the auctions, as gallerists, to say, we're going to do something different. We're going to create a space in which artists get residuals. And that means that instead of you just buying the piece, you're going to buy the license. And that the person who helped make those things will always get something back every time it resells, especially the artist. And it's not just about you accumulating assets and wealth and extracting, because so much of our world is so extractive. And so it's like, how do we move to a space that's much more reciprocal, in which we truly get to be in deep relationship with each other, in which we think about our ecosystem and we say that these hierarchies should not exist. It should not just be these people making money off of this artist who's laboring and who can barely afford their rent or their studio fees. And so I think that that's really where it sits for me, is that we have to choose to practice something different, and we have an opportunity to do so. Again, it's a choice, and every day we wake up and we say, I'm going to participate in capitalism in this way, or I'm not going to participate in capitalism in this way.
Oh, that makes me think of something Alice Wong, another incredible disability justice thinker and author and editor of Disability Visibility, says that change is a creative practice. And I love thinking about it that way, because it does get very arduous. It does get very, we're in the muck, we're in the weeds of it, and sometimes it's not glamorous. Sometimes it's not speaking on a stage like this. Sometimes it's going through intrusive thoughts and trying to rewire those negative beliefs and all that. Sometimes it's conflict with friends. Sometimes it just looks like things that aren't as pretty to share. And so I think about, another thing I'm thinking about is a process of unmasking. Are y'all familiar with masking? And it's a term that a lot of neurodivergent people use to say, it's a synonym to pretending. Just going out in the world and putting on this mask. You can think of it as code switching too, but it's like, for me as an autistic ADHD person, multiply disabled and neurodivergent, masking has a visceral, harmful, violent effect on my body. I will mask and then I'll come home and just be not a person and be a shell for 2 days. And so I'm always thinking about, how can I bring more honesty and more vulnerability into any space where honesty and vulnerability might not be encouraged or welcome. And sometimes honesty and vulnerability isn't safe. I'm not safe to be myself in a lot of spaces. I'm not safe to be unmasked. And so even the other week, I ended up posting something on Instagram because I had major insomnia. I was up at 4 a.m. I was experiencing so much financial scarcity. Work has been so slow over the past year. And I was like, this is ridiculous. Why do I feel like nothing is going wrong? And I'm doing so much, and yet nothing seems to be happening. And so I just decided it was 4 a.m. I just typed something on my story and then exported it and posted it online, and woke up with 200 comments. And it was nuts, the amount of people saying, I'm in solidarity with you, you're putting words to things that I've been feeling. And it just really, something that I learned from my creative practices is the things that feel the scariest to say are actually probably the things that need to be most needed to be said. And so I just think about that in terms of, as artists, how can we be honest with, hey, I'm experiencing this, like, have you experienced the same thing? Transparency about, this is the rate I'm getting, what about you? Does this feel good for you? Like, just, I'm going through this, have you been through something similar? So just kind of opening up the channels for communication feels like that feels really needed right now, that kind of level of like radical honesty and vulnerability.
I agree, because a lot of what might be happening to you, it could look similar but completely different to someone else, but they could still have the experience of that, of, having the scarcity and having, thoughts that are intrusive, but having that idea of being able to talk to someone else as well that might be experiencing that and understanding, and that openness, I think, is really important for us as well.
I guess one thing I do want to name that I feel like is very important is that, at least for me, I'm going to speak I statements. Like, I have a lot of privilege, and I recognize that privilege, and that I can wake up every day and choose whether I'm going to participate in capitalism in a certain way. We all do not have that same privilege. And recognizing that, I think, is so important. Because oftentimes, we get into these spaces where we're like, we need to be doing X, Y, and Z. And if you're not doing X, Y, and Z, then you're not radical enough. Or you're not truly committed to the movement or committed to liberation. And not giving ourselves grace and space to recognize that, like, I can decide to go take a hot yoga class at 10:30 in the middle of the day because I have the privilege to do that. Not everyone has the privilege to do that. And so thinking about the way that our privilege shows up in our practices as well, I think is like very deeply important to this work.
Last night during the panel that was had at the gallery as part of the symposium, there was the conversation of contemplation as a privilege. And for those of us who do have the privilege to sit and to contemplate and to be reflective and to be self-reflective, while we know many other people are just waking up trying to figure out how they're going to eat that day, how they're going to care for their children. And I feel a deep sense of responsibility with this privilege, not just of the time to contemplate, but also the privilege of, I say my platform privilege, what it means to have a voice in this space. Even the privilege of relationships, to travel and to be hearing different ideas and to be bringing new practices and new frameworks into my work. It feels like a responsibility that I have to be gaining and bringing in this information and taking it back to the community to say, here's what I've learned, here's how we can, be reflective of what other people are doing. And so I'm so happy you brought that up, because the privilege that we have to just contemplate and to say, how can we design, how can we build, how can we come into community, is a important strain of liberation, those of us who have the space, because it is a work of ours to do the contemplating and then to actually act on it. And when we don't, we are doing a deep disservice to our community, and we are not taking full advantage of the privilege that we have in this space. Mm-hmm.
I'm also wondering about when we think about equity in terms of care and what that looks like across the board and investing in care for multitudes of communities and people that you're working with and working for.
I'll speak from a particular experience of raising funds for the foundation. One of the things that we've been doing is holding even more privileged people accountable to how they're engaging with us. So in 2020, when everyone cared about Black people for a little bit, we had such an influx of donations, people saying, oh, here is a Black organization that we can say that we've donated to be a part of this movement. And what my CEO, Charlene Kimmler, ended up doing is that she demanded, you could not we were not interested in your corporate donation unless you signed a 3-year contract. And you have to sign an NDA, and you cannot tell anyone that you donated to us. We are not at all a public opportunity for you to exist. And that also is a space of were we allowed to do that? Were we, I remember Charlene calling me and being like, Rachel, I was on a Zoom with a very prestigious fashion house, and she asked to see a photo of their board. And she's like, I want to see photos, who's on your board? And they were so taken aback by this demand that they ended the call fairly quickly, and we didn't really hear back from them again. But us being willing to make them uncomfortable and to hold them accountable to their privilege, these are, frameworks we can build into our systems, and they still show up today. And, we've been able to give over $4 million of therapy care to Black women and girls, and that is because we held people accountable when they just wanted to use us as an opportunity to feel better about themselves. And it was not true relationship. It was not true care. And so I just want to remind us of the possibility that we can make demands as well.
Because it's also so inauthentic when they're saying, well, we have to donate, or there were so many funds that were coming out of saying we're donating to all these, co-ops and all the Black fashion designers, but what are we hearing about that now? And also, what was the process of giving the money, but then also seeing that, reaching goals and milestones to help them build, right? And that wasn't happening. That's another form of care, right? From institutions and financial institutions, that it's like, well, we gave the money and that was it, but were you really setting them up for success?
Yeah, and we also weren't interested in making them better. My work was not to make these white institutions better. My work was actually to get their money in order to care for Black women, because that's my work. And so I'm good with my energy. I see where I put it, and I can play the game of capitalism in the way that I see who has what and how it can be redistributed with my privilege, but I had to, and anyone who has followed my work for any amount of time has seen the shift from me feeling like I want to be in conversation with whiteness to being like, oh, actually, I don't have much interest or investment here. I'd rather just move it into caring for this Black spaces. And I think that's a shift that a lot of us are making and need to continue to make, because I really don't have much hope in whiteness, and that's not where I'm looking to put my efforts of even deconstructing or building. Instead, it's to build in this landscape that I actually want to seed and, tend to.
Yeah, I feel like the equity question is so interesting, especially as someone who spends a lot of time doing a lot of fundraising and being in relationship to folks in philanthropy. And I feel like I'm often at tables and in rooms in which people are like, how could we do something different? And then you put a thing out there, and they're like, oh, we could never do that. And so one of the things that I proposed to someone in philanthropy was, instead of asking organizations to apply, how about you come apply to fund me?
Yes.
Let's shift the dynamic. It's a privilege to be able to fund the work that I do.
Yes.
And for some reason, you don't see that. You feel opposite. And so in order for us to talk about equity and changing the hierarchy and the dynamic, let's recognize that you get to list me on your website, and that makes you look better, and that you get to parachute out whenever you feel like it, and leave us desolate and so forth. And so how do we change those dynamics? And I think a lot of it is really rooted in our systems. There's an idea of trust-based philanthropy and all these things that are coming up within that space. Non-extractive capital, and just trying to think differently about the way that we do economic development and community development and so forth. How we start de-siloing art and organizing. Artists are organizers, we are cultural organizers. That is our work. That should be our work in many cases. And so really trying to rethink those dynamics. And push people, when they say, there's a new idea, I'm open to hearing it, and not being afraid to say the thing, even if you know that they're gonna be like, oh no, we could never do that, when you really could, because again, institutions are just people. We make these decisions every day, we put these policies in place every day, we can change them if we want to, we just have to want to.
Ooh, okay, I want to share one tool that is coming to mind, a practice that I was doing with a coach to move through all this, because I honestly need more of this energy, because I grew up in a super conservative, religious Christian household where I was raised by a Korean immigrant mother, where I was just taught so much deference. Literally, I was taught to bow to anyone older than me and then punished if I didn't. There was just this deep culture. The beauty of it is that I grew up with this deep respect for elders, but also there was just, I never was taught to challenge authority. I was never taught to question what was. And that's something I had to really, and still actively cultivating within myself. And I was working with a coach years ago trying to leave my advertising career. And I was talking about my discomfort being in conversation with white people, especially the summer of 2020, when I just felt so like during the summer of 2020, being in the presence of white people felt violent to me. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, okay, how do I somatically not leave my body when I am in conversation with white people at work? And when I was doing this activity with my coach really called me in and said, oh, Jezz, I see that you really lean in a lot. Like you're really kind of holding this posture of deference. And so I had to actively train myself to, when I am in conversation with white people, older people, people who are in assigned positions of authority, to lean back, like lean my body back, push my shoulders back, really hold the shape of my own body, root into my ancestral lineage spiritually, really like in somatics we learn like the height of your body is in relationship to the sky, the earth. Your width is your connection to your ancestors, your friends, the people you love. And so actively practicing that, so I want to offer that to anyone, that somatic practice of rooting into the length and width of your body and just tuning into the shape and like really holding that shape when you feel that you want to be, you want to lean into something. And I'm really inspired by the students' like 10 toes down energy of like, no, these are our demands and they are absolutely reasonable. And look at what's at stake. We cannot be okay with genocide. We cannot be okay with genocide is what they're saying. And so that's something I'm actively practicing, because to be honest, I need more of that.
Thank you for sharing.
And to not make yourself feel small. And like, I notice myself doing that too. And in meetings, when talking to people and saying like, I deserve to be here too, right? And I have to show that in myself and my posture. And so I really resonate with that as well. Thank you. That's a good practice for all of us to take from this conversation of one thing. Yeah. I'm also going back to thinking about what's happening in our world and in tumultuous times that we're in right now, and what's the greatest influence that you have in exploring transformation during the times that we're having right now, and how can we best influence this awareness and need for self-care, especially right now?
I've just been reading books again from intellectual ancestors from other movements in other countries, just remembering that this isn't the first time we've had to do these things. And I think sometimes we have the weight of quote unquote figuring it out, but if we know we have some tools, that for me personally has given me a bit of space to continue to explore these hard questions and to exist in this hard world in this way. And I think that one of the best ways to continue to transfer it to each other is to practice it and to witness it in each other. I'm very moved when people vocalize to me that they've seen something in me that I've been really working hard to practice or to beam out of me, whether it's like care for my community or even my own practice of like softness and stillness and rest. And I think that this practice of witnessing and being witnessed is one of the quickest ways to perhaps move from community into relationship and to be more honest. This woman who I used to date, she used to say, Rachel, I don't believe that you're friends with so-and-so. And I'd be like, why would you say something like that to me? And she said, because they haven't been to your house when it's messy. And I'd be like, okay. She's like, they don't know you. They don't really know you. You always have, manage your perception with them. And that is not relationship. That is not community. And so this idea of witnessing each other, both in our goodness and our mess, has been one of the biggest ways that I have transformed my community to where I'm like, yes, come over now, or yes, I want to see you in this moment, both the very, very good and the really, really hard. And that has been one of the biggest ways of transferring possibility and community and presence, and it's changed me, yeah.
So I think for me, I don't know, I find so much care and love and support in my co-op space. It's just folks who are deeply values aligned, are deeply committed to movement and liberation, are deeply committed to doing something different together as artists. And I think that for me is like really the root of so many things in terms of transformation. We have an opportunity to invite other artists into this ecosystem, into this community, to help other people think about what it means to build wealth in a way that's beyond just money, to help us think differently about what it means to not own but steward our assets together, to steward our land, to be in a different relationship, to put people and the planet over profit, and again, to just do things deeply and very differently. I think a lot about this quote from Toni K. Bambara when she says in The Salt Eaters, "Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? Because wholeness is no trifling matter." And I think a lot about, like, once you know, you can't unknow. And like so many of us know, but we're trying to like act like we don't. And for me, I'm like, you know, it sucks sometimes to know. It's actually a very hard thing to be like, quote unquote, woke or whatever it is. It's like, now that I know, I have to do something differently. Because if not, then I'm complacent. And I don't want to be complacent within these systems. I don't want to be complacent in harmful spaces and violence. I want to actively do something different with the understanding that like we're not going to always get it right. And that when we don't get it right, that doesn't mean that we dispose each other. That doesn't mean that we cancel each other. That we have to be in a space of true accountability. And accountability for me means that Rachel does not have to hold me accountable, because that's labor for Rachel. That means that I'm holding myself accountable, and I'm not asking other people to do that labor and to constantly having to remind me how I say that I'm gonna show up in community or in relationship. And so yeah, I think a lot about those is kind of my practices and how I feel like transformation can happen.
I love that a lot. I think about, in terms of relationships and friendship building, I think about conversations as a creative practice, in that I am such a language-rooted person. Like my first artistic practice, it was writing. Ever since I was young, it was how I moved through a lot of childhood trauma. And language is what helps me unlock things. I can't even identify things that I'm experiencing or feeling unless I have language for it sometimes. And that's why the Dreaming Different podcast was born, because I was unlocking all this language from the neurodiversity paradigm, the neurodiversity movement, and just my entire world was expanding and opening up. And then my autistic urge to be like, everyone, I want to show and tell everything I've learned. Like, here are all the books that I've been reading, and here's all the language, and here's this chart that I made, and here's all these amazing people that I've been learning from. And so I've been finding a lot of inspiration in conversations. Like, I was hanging out with my friend Pigeon, who's here somewhere. As soon as I landed in Chicago, we had dinner and just kind of processing together what we're going through. And I just find so much comfort in that quality time of like deep, like eye-to-eye contact. We're here together, we're sharing a meal, we're in this, and figuring out like, okay, what world are you building? What world am I building? How can we merge these worlds together? And it feels like we can kind of go further together that way.
Friendship as a safe space, right? Be able to communicate your feelings and no judgment, right? I think that's another way. That's what you're saying, right? Andrea, you talked a little bit about In Care of Black Women, and then I also want to know and share with the audience a little bit more about this newly formed collective also that you're working with, and some of the resources and what you're doing in terms of this collective care in Chicago as well.
Yeah, so for about 18 months now, In Care of Black Women has been incubating a co-op called Cooperation Racine. At the end of 2022, I purchased a mixed-use building in Inglewood, which is where I'm born and raised and grew up, with this idea that I wanted to move my wood shop, which is in a building that I live in currently, out of that space and into a larger space. And at the time, we were doing this residency for Black women, femmes, non-binary people to have a space to just play, to learn how to make with wood. They didn't have to have a show or, anything coming up. It was just a space to truly just play. And, because artists are artists, people show up at 2 a.m., turning on table saws and things like that. And I'm upstairs asleep. And so, it was not a good fit. And we very quickly outgrew the space. And so the idea was that I reached out to a group of almost 40 artists, some of whom I knew very well, some of whom I didn't know very well, and said, hey, I bought this building. I'm interested in starting a cooperative. I want to know if anybody wants to come build a ship with me. And so, of those 40 folks, 7 said, I think I want to come build the ship. Another 15 or so said, once y'all build the ship, I'll come and hang out, and I think I'll be a member then. And so we spent 12 sessions, about 4 months, just going through cooperative education training together. And so learning the history of Black cooperative economic thought and practice. A really incredible book, Collective Courage, is a great resource for us in understanding the history of Black cooperation and how it comes out of mutual aid, and how it truly is a challenge to capitalism, and helping us understand a lot of the pitfalls of Black cooperatives and why they were not quote unquote successful, so that we do not repeat those things. We've been doing a lot of fundraising. We have a plan to restore a building that has a lot of history. In the 1920s, there was a soda prohibition era bar. There was really a bar, but they claimed that they were a soda bar. It was a church, it was a candy store, it was a beauty salon, it was a secret bar at some point. It had many, many lives. And it's sat vacant for over 15 years now. And so the idea is that we want to use art and cooperation in particular as a way to really think about how we spur development in a different way, but also how we seed other cooperative creative economies. And so there are all of these intersecting moments in the art ecosystem. There's an artist who makes their work, and maybe they don't. Maybe they have a fabricator or studio assistants. There's someone who helps prepare and ship that work, and that they make those crates. There's someone who's stretching, canvas for frames. There's someone who's preparing that work. There's a gallerist. There's a collector. There are all these folks in that ecosystem. And how do we start to dismantle those hierarchies and think differently about them? How do we start to create cooperatives that help support that ecosystem? And so, as an artist, when you need to go get your work made, you can go to a co-op and be able to plug into that space, that we can create workforce development opportunities for young people in the arts, and that they can learn how to do shipping, they can learn how to do crating, they can learn how to be a preparator, and to just really think differently about the art ecosystem. And using Chicago as the model. We have such a rich history of organizing and being in movement. And so to really be deeply rooted in a restorative and solidarity economy that helps artists, again, build wealth, but think differently about their relationship to the world and the ecosystem at large.
Thank you. And Jezz, you mentioned your podcast with Deem, and I wonder if you can, we were just talking a little bit backstage about it, and I was thinking this idea, how you said that when you first started, your mind was totally expansive and wanted to share all this information, and there's a lot more to come with that too. Can we talk just a little bit about it? Yeah.
Yes. We've been recording season 2 of Dreaming Different, and I just want to shout out working with Deem. Deem is truly my favorite collaborator. Like throughout the whole process, care has just been baked in. There's been so much spaciousness, flexibility, fluidity, but also great quality of work always. And it's been such an honor to work with Deem on it. And our first episode has topics like building access into friendship, decolonizing rest and self-care, neuroqueering, and the art of advocacy, the science of neurodiversity. They're really juicy topics where I just get to fully nerd out. The second season, we have the politics of unmasking. We have the neurodivergent approach to the creative process and writing through the lens of neurodivergence. We have spirituality and neurodivergence. What does mindfulness and meditation look like for a neurodivergent person? Because it looks different. And then we're going to have a neuroscientist talk about the effects of cannabis on neurodivergence and the specifics of that. So there's so many great conversations that we have lined up. So you can find that on deemjournal.com/audio. There's also transcripts. The first season took a full year to make because we, combed through all the transcripts, wanted to make sure everything was as accessible as we could make it. And so if you want to listen to that, it's available anywhere you can listen to podcasts. And then Rachel, when we talked on Zoom, you mentioned talking about grief
in terms of care. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that. I've been thinking about that since then, and like how we can think about that idea in terms of healing as well.
Yeah, I mean, of all the things that I've publicly spoken about, nothing has resonated with people more than grief. And it's really shocked me into recognizing a new vein of community and conversation, because grief goes across so many aspects of our life, whether it's parenting or even job loss, or the experience of scarcity, this grief of who and how we thought we might be able to exist in the world. And my grief came from personal loss. In between 2022 and 2023, I lost my mother and my grandmother and my older sister. And it threw me into an identity crisis that demanded I figure out what chosen family is, particularly as a queer woman, that I figured out the depths of friendship that I was willing to go to be able to say, like, actually, I do want to heal, and I am about to do this work. And I think grief is such a beautiful conduit for us to have deeper understanding about ourselves and deeper connection with each other, because one of the sayings that has resonated most with me after losing my mother in particular is there are those of us who are grieving and those of us who have no idea what's coming. And that has felt very true. For once my mother passed away, I was like, whoa. I was looking in the eyes of strangers, seeing that same grief, and it has offered me such a deeper connection with the world, witnessing. I have been spending lots of time in Kingston, Jamaica, and right now at the National Gardens, there are the century palms that they bloom after 100 years and then they die. And they're in bloom right now. And so we went to go see them, and I felt in such grief practice with the trees at that moment. Like having ushered my mother into her dying and being able to be in relationship with the trees, saying, I see you going out, and say hi to my mom on whatever the other side is. This opportunity to be in new relationship with life through grief has been really, really moving for me, and it's been showing up in my art practice, getting into things like ceramics. I've been building things that speak to my grief practice. I wash my feet a lot in the river in Jamaica, and so creating vessels to carry with me to the river. These types of ways that my art can be in direct relationship with myself, and gifting these things to other people. Say, I see you grieving. I know that you might want to pick a flower every so often. Let me build this single bud vase to allow you to continue to offer something new to your altar. So I think there's some design in grief, and I'm looking forward to seeing how we might be able to meet each other in that space. Thank you.
Well, I'm being mindful of our time on this blinking clock that we have here. I am so in awe of all three of you, and I want to thank you for taking the time to hold space and being trusting in me to ask all these wonderful questions of you all and a wonderful audience too. Is there any last tangible thing that our audience can take away from our conversation? I was listening before to Trisha in the back room, and she kept saying to breathe, which is a really good one. And I've been trying to do that in this whole conversation while keeping up. Is there anything else before we close out?
Yeah, I'd say, cooperate with your people. Truly figure out, who are my people? Who do I want to build the world that I want to live in with? And, study cooperation and practice it. There is an alternative to capitalism. Mm-hmm. It exists. It's existed for many, many years. It's being practiced all over the world. It's being practiced here every single day. And we have an opportunity to choose differently. And the thing that we have to do is we have to study. We have to study and we have to practice. And so the invitation is to study and practice. And if you are an artist here in Chicago and you want to cooperate, our co-op is open to that. And we will invite you in to cooperate with us as well.
Does anyone else here experience chronic anxiety? Okay, lots of hands. Qigong is really helpful for me, so I just want to offer that tool that you can just search on YouTube, Qigong, Qigong. It's just a way to like move your body and breathe at the same time. It's almost like standing yoga. And also vagus nerve exercises. Those have been really life-changing for me. And it's so as simple as like holding your head in one place and just moving your eyes from like keeping your eyes at the top left corner until you yawn, and then keeping your eyes at the top right corner until you yawn, and it just resets your nervous system and activates your parasympathetic nervous system. So leaving that, and then also, there was one more thing, but I forgot. Maybe after you go.
I guess I just want to offer the invitation to be seen. And I think that that's such a scary, vulnerable thing. And it's been a practice I've been working on. But just to remind you that it's an option, and dissociating isn't. Although it is a tool that we have used. And I think speaking of design, we speak of tools a lot. So I guess also in being seen, I want to offer you the invitation to switch out your tools. The tools that might have worked for you before, the tools that might have worked for us as children, of being small, of being quiet, of folding ourselves. We can take a moment to thank those tools for how they served us, but we can pick up new tools like cooperation. We can pick up new tools like being willing to be witnessed. And so I invite you to, look at your tools and figure out which ones we might need to switch out in order to go to new heights and make new growth towards our liberation.
I remember now.
Oh, good.
Okay. Our bodies are the site of immense trauma and pain, but also our bodies are a site of wisdom and immense intuition. So sometimes reframing, like when I get into these spirals of, oh my gosh, I'm so doomed, I'm just going to be depressed for the rest of my life, I just try to tune into, no, actually, my body has immense wisdom from that very pain, from that ancestral trauma, and that intuition can be used to create the world that I want to live in.
It's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for this generous conversation.